case anyone forgot. Have you opened the webinar, Maya? Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. We'll give you a few moments to enter the virtual room, and I will spend the next couple of minutes filling the silence while everyone's getting comfortable. Welcome to this exciting webinar hosted by Sustain. It's called The Role of Agroecology in Urban Community Gardens. It's been a real pleasure to organise this with my colleague Maya, who works on London's Capital Growth Food Growing Network with me, and my other colleague Bella, who works on the National Good to Grow Network. And you might see the three of us popping up occasionally throughout the next hour and a half to help with the Q&A, for example, or launch a couple of surveys. And if you don't already know, we're really in for a treat this morning because we're joined by some amazing thinkers and doers in this area. We're keeping our cameras on just for the start so that you can see our panelists. Hope it's sunny where you all are today. It's really sunny in my little pocket of East London, and it's been lovely to hear people talk about sowing seeds and getting ready for the new growing season. As most of you know, today's webinar also officially launches this year's Good to Grow Day. Richard, our chair, will tell you more about this in a moment. But just before I hand over to Richard Choksey from Social Farms and Gardens, who is chairing today's webinar, I'll just mention a couple of little bits of housekeeping. We're on Zoom webinar today, folks, so a little bit different to a Zoom meeting. You can still use the chat function. We also have a Q&A function. Please introduce yourselves in the chat function with your name and the growing space that you're involved with. It really helps everyone have a sense of who's joining us today. And we're recording today's event as well, so we will be sure to share the recording and the amazing slides that our panelists will be sharing, and we'll do that following the webinar in an email to all of you lovely people. And finally, my colleague Bella has prepared a couple of very quick fire surveys for us today, just to make sure we're all awake and thinking about these really interesting themes. So I think Bella is going to include in the chat the link for Mentimeter. All that we ask that you do is pop that in a web browser. There it goes now. And if we do this while we're all still getting comfortable, that would be great. And it's really straightforward. There's a couple of questions, and we would love you to pop that in your, oh, here we go. What words come to mind when you think of agroecology? So what you need to do is put the Mentimeter website in your browser, put that code in, and then contribute some of your ideas. And just while you're doing that, it's quite funky because it will come up with all your contributions. Just a reminder, please do use the chat function like I've already said. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for our amazing panelists. As you probably know, there's a specific Q&A function for that. So if you can remember to use the Q&A, that will make it easier for my colleagues this morning. And please, in the chat function, remember to select all panelists and attendees so that we can all hear from you. So Richard, I'm going to hand over to you, and you can interpret this amazing Mentimeter and tell us a little bit more about today's webinar and agenda.
Thanks so much, Fee, and thank you for inviting me to chair this wonderful meeting. Hello, everybody, on this beautiful spring day. This feels like a great opportunity to launch into the growing season, especially with the weather so beautiful, at least here in London. I can see lots of responses to the Mentimeter, and I'm pleased to see that we've got a real mix of responses that kind of speak to the holistic nature of agroecology. It isn't simply a set of practices or a management regime. It's a set of principles that frame our relationship with the environment and situate agriculture as a central part of our relationship with the natural world. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind when we think about the urban environment as well, because it's quite easy to become divorced from the systems of production that serve our plates. But agroecology really recognizes that we are embedded in a social and cultural system of production, and that we really need to participate in a grassroots way. And so I'm pleased to see, alongside words like biodiversity, sustainability, growing, we've also got justice, community, diversity, health, growth, regenerative. So all of these things speak to the fact that our relationship with the environment is deeply bound up with our relationship with each other and notions of justice. So with those things in mind, I'm really thrilled to introduce a fantastic range of speakers who will be offering both practical and theoretical perspectives on agroecology and what it means to us specifically in the urban environment. And I'd first like to invite Dr. Beth Nicholls to speak. Beth is the UKRA Future Leaders Fellow at the University of Sussex, and she studies the flower visiting decisions of insect pollinators, and she's going to be sharing some of the impacts that she's found on food production with us today. So Beth, please take it away.
Thanks, Richard. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone hear and see me okay? Perfect. Okay, I'm just going to make you guys a bit smaller. So thanks very much to the webinar organisers for inviting me to come and speak today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work we've been doing at the University of Sussex, looking at the productivity of urban growing, but also the role that pollinators have to play in urban food production as well. And so I'm sure I don't have to convince many of you here today that the way that we conventionally farm in and it's also a huge emitter of greenhouse gases as well. And somewhat ironically, I suppose, the habitat destruction and the biodiversity loss associated with this environmental damage is also undermining some of the ecosystem services that this type of farming is really dependent on. So we know that about 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that we eat is owed to insect pollinators. And although we certainly wouldn't kind of starve without pollinating insects, our diets would definitely be a lot more bland and potentially kind of see from these two images. And so it's really concerning that insect populations in general and pollinator populations are in steep decline. We don't have great data actually on insect abundance, but this study that took place over 25 years in German nature reserves obviously ideally designed to conserve biodiversity, but even in these kind of protected habitats, we've seen a 75% decline in just kind of the weight of insects being sampled at this time. So that's really concerning given our dependency on insects for these ecosystem services such as pollination. Add to that the fact that our population is growing and also our urban population is growing. So around the globe, more and more people are moving away from rural areas where food has conventionally been grown into cities. And we know, for example, in the UK that over 1 million residents are living in so-called food deserts where people really struggle to access fresh or affordable food close to their homes. So this kind of raises the question about whether growing food in our cities or close to our cities might be a more sustainable solution for feeding urban population. And it's actually estimated that already urban agriculture may be providing up to 1/5 of the world's food. But typically, Urban farming is quite small scale. It can be quite ad hoc, particularly in developing countries. So this is an urban farm right in the center of Calcutta in India that's developed on the site of an old landfill. There's often kind of some question around kind of the legality of the farming and who actually owns the land. And as a result, this type of farming compared to conventional agriculture is typically much less well regulated and much less well kind of monitored. But actually getting accurate data on the productivity of this type of farming can be quite challenging. And so as part of a team of interdisciplinary researchers from the University of Sussex, kind of under the umbrella of the Sussex Sustainability Research Programme, we started by doing a literature search on the kind of limited data that is out there on urban agriculture and urban food growing, to look at where might the opportunities and also the kind of trade-offs be for urban agriculture to contribute to the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So these are kind of a broad set of targets aimed at improving life for all people on the planet without kind of leading to further degradation of the environment and habitats. And so obviously growing food in cities, one of the main benefits is to provide improved access to fresh food, and it can also improve livelihoods as well. And improving access to fresh food can then have knock-on effects on things like health and well-being. But it can also improve the sustainability of kind of food chains within a city. So just reducing the distance that food has to travel. If you are increasing the area of kind of green space, you're improving people's access to that space, but also compared to kind of concrete or other impervious surfaces, having more trees or more vegetation in cities can reduce the heat island effect, and it can also provide better defences against flooding. And there's some really good evidence coming out now that allotments and food growing areas in cities are a real sanctuary for biodiversity as well. And of course, if we're clearing land in cities to produce food, then it could reduce pressure in more protected and pristine areas. But land in cities is, under very high demand. So there's always going to be competition with other types of infrastructure such as housing. And depending on how the land has been used before, so for example, the landfill site in Calcutta, there could be exposure to heavy metals, for example, or other contaminants. And we don't really know the extent to which pesticides are used in urban agriculture, but if they're being used quite heavily, then they could be causing contamination of drinking water, for example. So then we also ran a case study in Brighton and Hove, which is where we're based, but it's also a very good site to kind of run this project because it's the first city in the UK to have a food strategy developed by the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership. And there is a lot of allotment space in Brighton and Hove. And although it kind of has that reputation of being this kind of home of the, liberal, wealthy people, there's also a lot of deprivation in the city and a lot of food poverty as well. So there is the potential to improve access to food through these growing schemes. So we worked with the growers themselves. They acted as citizen scientists, so they helped us to collect the data because it's quite hard to access allotment or private garden space. And they helped us to answer these three questions. So, how productive is growing food in urban areas? What are the risks from pesticide use? And how dependent is urban food production on insect pollination? So do we have enough pollinators in our city to pollinate the food that we want to grow there? So people weighed how much food they were harvesting from their plots. And this was building on a previous study by a PhD student in the lab, Linda Birkin. We also asked them to keep a diary of any pests that they encountered and what they did to control them. So did they use bug sprays? Did they just leave things well alone? And then we also asked them to do insect counts on their flowering crops as well. And so on average, people were harvesting about 70 kilos worth of food per season. And it's important to note that this is only insect pollinated crops, so berries and beans and that kind of thing. It doesn't include things like root vegetables, potatoes, some of the heavier crops actually. So it's likely to be an underestimation of kind of productivity. And the variability between growers was massive as well. So some people harvesting around 250 kilos. And on average, the yield was around 1 kilo per metre square, which fits quite nicely with what other people have found in similar studies around the world. But again, some people harvesting close to 10 kilos per metre squared, which is not, not bad. It's almost on a par with some conventional farming yields. We also helped growers to calculate how much their food would have cost to buy at the supermarket. And on average, people were harvesting around £500 worth of food per season. And we also calculated, based on how dependent that crop is on insect pollinators, what is the kind of pollinator price? So how much of that crop value is directly owed to pollinators? And that worked out at around £300 per grower per season. And things like cherries and raspberries, which are highly dependent on pollinators, but also pretty expensive to buy at the supermarket, came out with some of the highest pollinator prices. We were really encouraged to see that pesticide use was pretty low in the UK and in our Brighton case study. So less than 4% of cases were people using, non-organic conventional chemicals. Slug pellets are one of the exceptions. So a lot of people were using slug pellets, and that could have knock-on effects on birds or hedgehogs, for example, which feed on slugs. But I was really excited to see that the Royal RHS, which have traditionally been sort of more pro chemicals than not, have actually come out now to say that slugs and snails are no longer viewed as a pest, and they're going to encourage people to learn to kind of live with them. So it's important to note that when we were valuing our crops, we didn't account for kind of material and labour use, but a really great study from Australia did do this. So they actually found that urban farming, the yields were about twice that of commercial rural farms. This is mostly because they were using the land very efficiently, and we also found that in our kind of Brighton allotment sites, and also some work we've been doing in India. So multiple crops in the same patch of land across the season, or intercropping, having trees underplanted with other crops, for example. But this type of farming is super labour intensive because you can't really mechanise any aspect of it. And generally, these gardens were running at a loss, so they weren't profit making. And that's generally because energy use was very inefficient. But the authors of this study do provide some calculations that if the growers were to switch to non-renewable inputs and be a bit more careful about kind of energy use, then they could come down to be on a par with commercial farming. There's obviously lots of other benefits of urban agriculture as well, aside from just productivity. So there's quite a few studies demonstrating the improved connection to nature, increased community cohesion, and even this really nice study where they age matched allotment holders with their neighbours living in exactly the same kind of communities, and found that those with allotments were more active and were healthier than their neighbours without. And as I kind of mentioned before, the evidence for the biodiversity benefits of allotments is pretty compelling in the UK, at least, as well. So this was an amazing kind of large-scale study that took place over 4 cities in the UK, comparing lots of different green spaces, including nature reserves and gardens and parks. And they really found that allotments supported the highest bee abundance. And here in this kind of circular figure, they're showing what the gains for biodiversity would be from increasing areas of different habitats, such as nature reserves. And you can see that, again, allotments come out kind of on top. Cemetery is also quite good, but I'm not sure what the kind of ethics are around increasing the area of cemeteries in cities. So in conclusion, in our small case study, we found that urban farming can be productive, and in our subset of participants, at least, the pesticide use was low. And insect pollination is clearly vital to urban agriculture. And we did a few other kind of experiments around that as well, which I'm happy to talk about later. But of course, you do need to consider the cost of labour and other resources as well, which our case study didn't. But on the whole, there are multiple other benefits, including for the climate, for biodiversity, and for health and well-being. So thanks very much for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Beth. That was thrilling to see the nature emergency being confronted and analysed at a really grassroots community level. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say to participants, everybody here has local community gardens nearby, and we'd really like to spotlight them during this session. So for those of you who aren't yet associated with the community space, I'd encourage you to have a look at the Sustain's Good to Grow Day, which is coming up at the end of April, and gives you an opportunity to get involved in some really exciting and enjoyable community gardening activities, to meet new people and re-engage with those from previous seasons. Yeah, as Beth said, we really do welcome questions. So for those of you who are curious to hear more about anything from any of the speakers, please drop questions in the Q&A, and we'll swing back around to them soon enough. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Vicki Hird, who is the head of sustainable farming at Sustain. She's recently published a new book called Rebugging the Planet, which is an homage to insects and other invertebrates, why they are so essential to our ecosystem and what we can do to help them. So Vicki, without further ado, please take the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be speaking at the launch of Good to Grow. Fabulous, very important, and as we just heard from Beth, critically vital activities in urban and peri-urban areas everywhere. So really pleased to be here. I do have some slides which are mostly pictures of bugs, but they will lead us to be talking about what I want to talk about. So we'll go from there. And so how urban food growers can address the climate nature crisis. Should be going to full screen. Hope you can all see that all right. So I did want to say, yeah, I've published a book last year which was about the crisis in invertebrates, not just insects, which Beth has alluded to brilliantly, so I don't need to talk too much about that. But I also run the farming campaign at Sustain, and the picture in the middle of this slide is the fringe farming report that we brought out just now, which is about commercial and community enterprises in the peri-urban and urban, but the peri-urban fringe in particular, where there's a lot of land that can be used to grow food in agroecological ways. And so we've got a big campaign around that, supported by lots of partners and cities. So it's a really exciting time to be talking about this. And of course, there's a lovely bee fly there, which on a primula that you'll see. I've got lots of pictures of bugs, but I did look around for a good slide about agroecology, and there isn't one. They're all like this, incredibly complex, incredibly difficult to show on one slide, because agroecology is about all of it. Obviously, in a simple sense, agroecology is the study of farming with nature, but people use it to talk about agroecological farm systems and growing systems, and it's about growing with nature and climate and people in mind, and it has multiple applications along the whole supply chain. So it's not just about the farming itself, it's about how the food is used, how the workers are treated, how the people are treated in the system, and how the trade happens. So it's a really important, critical approach to farming that we know now, as we've known for some years, that the food is produced in ways which are broken. The whole supply chain is broken, and systems are broken because the farmers don't get adequate reward, people don't get healthy food, and we haven't got time to cover all that here, but I thought I'd just show that it's a complex system. But what I aim to cover here is why I started writing the book, and what I'm aiming to achieve with that and with our work, and the importance of the urban refuge, which we've heard a bit about already, really critically, and how we can rebug our life and growing spaces. And these are some of the bugs that I've captured through the last year or so in my garden and around in Hackney, just showing.
Sorry, Vicki, are you
Yes?
changing slides because we can't see
Oh no, that's annoying. Don't know how to
It's
show.
not in presentation mode for us.
Yeah, it is. Thought it was. Oh dear, what a pain. Got some lovely pictures. I don't know how to. Did you see the first one?
We can see the first slide with the
Oh,
title.
so it's not. Gosh, I don't know how to do it. So this was a classic, because I said I'll do it myself, and now it's not working.
Vicki, would you like me to try and pull them up?
Yeah, they're slightly different, but yes, if you can, thanks.
Sure.
That is very frustrating. I'll stop sharing. So the next slide that I'm going to show, which is a picture of a vapor moth in my son's hands, which we took in my garden when I was rescuing, in my kitchen when I was rescuing a vapor moth and putting it outside. And I was using that picture to show that people working in urban areas with agroecological food growing with nature, with minimum chemicals, maximum diversity in the system, and nurturing the natural systems under the soil and above. You are the critical nurturers of our environment, and I'll thank you. There you go. I hope that's showing for everybody. Vapor moth. I just sort of use that to show that you're the critical people doing work which is going to be protecting the nature, because urban environments and peri-urban environments can be a critical refuge for the bugs and for the invertebrates and the insects and other invertebrates, which we desperately need for our food system. And we know that one of the biggest problems for invertebrates, for the bugs globally, is the fragmentation of their habitats. They've got smaller and smaller spaces to live, and fewer and fewer ways to move between those spaces, to recolonize, to mate, to allow a recolonization of an area, for allow a pollination to happen. Those green corridors which green spaces provide are getting less and less globally and in the UK. So that fragmentation is extremely dangerous, but also there's fewer refuges for invertebrates, the bees, the spiders, the moths, the butterflies, in the rural areas where we've had increased intensity of farming. So you in urban areas provide some incredibly important refuges and green spaces and green corridors that allow the invertebrates to move and to recolonize. So this is a nurturing picture for all of you who are nurturing. Next slide, please. And the next slide, if I remember what it is, yes, it's a hoverfly, bee mimic hoverfly, I think, or wasp mimic hoverfly, and showing the pollinators, which we've heard about a lot already. Obviously, absolutely critical. We wouldn't have the food that we have without them. I don't need to talk to you about that. But the other thing it represents is something which I talk about in the book, which is rebugging attitudes. Because some people seeing this might think, oh, it's going to sting me. It's got all those colors of a wasp or a bee and it's going to sting me. And people will react. And I think what we need to have is a rebugging of our attitudes, that when we talk to people, and particularly young people, about invertebrates and insects, we are talking about it differently. There's so few that are actually going to hurt you or sting you or make you ill. That we need to sort of react to them differently and explain their role in the system, in nature, and how beautiful they are. But to rebug our attitudes is a critical part of the role of urban agriculture and a critical part of agroecology, getting people to understand why nature should be part of the farming system rather than keeping it out, which chemicals and monocultures do. No, you can go on to the next slide. Next slide is about well-being and beauty and joy, which you can find in urban allotment plot if it's grown to allow the bugs in and to create the systems whereby you get all the benefits of nature, the pollinating benefits, the pest control benefits. Any gardener knows the benefits of ladybirds and other predators of pests. You know, they will gobble up thousands of aphids a day if you let them, the ladybird larvae and ladybirds themselves, and many other animals like beetles, really good at slug control. So if you create habitats like wood piles and you leave some of the aphids, you create an environment where nature is doing the work for you, but you also create an environment which is beautiful and rich and colourful, and also which has noise. Looking at a butterfly, you might not think noise, but without the bugs, we haven't got the birds. And obviously a lot of people love the birds. Next slide, please. This is a flower crab spider. And in my initial slides, I had thinking about how we are capturing people. It's a sort of allegory, capturing people into the excitement of nature and agroecology and food growing in an urban environment. When people walk past a place which is full of colour and life and diversity, they might get interested. Then you can bring them in and talk about the bugs and the fresh food and the nutrient value of that fresh food. So it's just a capturing kind of thing. Flower crab spiders they do eat bees, but they also eat flies. So they can be a really good pest control. Next Next
Sorry, Vicki,
slide,
that's
please.
1 minute to go.
Okay, I'm going to have to go really quickly. This is a mint moth. Next slide, please. I've got loads of slides on my picture. Next slide. I'll have to go right the way through just to show you. Next, please. All the ways. This is, I think, just an amazing looking animal. Captured. All these are in my garden, by the way. And my garden is a 10-foot by 10-foot urban garden in Hackney. And I grow some food and a lot of herbs and a lot of flowers I let grow, and I let the weeds grow. And we shouldn't be calling them weeds because they provide a critical habitat for bugs such as this, which then go on to pollinate other bugs. And again, you can talk to people about why this isn't going to sting you. It's really important. And all the wasps and all those other animals, spiders, critically important. Next slide. I did want to talk about water. I think Beth talked a bit about the natural capital, the ways in which urban food growing can actually help the critical services, ecosystem services, be improved. And in terms of water, there is a sort of increasing evidence of urban food growing and even large scale urban food growing can actually capture the water and reduce flooding in urban settings, and they can obviously increase the ecological value of a place and the wildlife and well-being. And these are all things that local authorities should be measuring and should be seeing the value of, and therefore providing the land and the training and potentially funding for urban food growing. And this is a wolf spider drinking in my very tiny pond. But water, capturing water and holding it in a space in soil as opposed to concrete or buildings is such an important thing that urban food growing can do. Next slide. I think we're getting to the end. Another crab spider, pest services, but also this is a honeybee, so you might not like that, but I just think it's amazing. Nature in the raw being seen on your plot. Yeah, next slide. This was about education because I spent a while lying in my garden watching this tawny bee fly going into the holes and staying still in a space, getting children to stay still and watch. What they will see is amazing. Staying still and just watching, and you will see some of the bugs. Next slide. And the worms, I haven't got time to talk about this, but underground, the critical services that the earthworms, the springtails, the ants, the mites, doing such important processes, and they move through spaces. And as they move, they take the microbes, they take the important spores from fungi, which do services somewhere else. So it's actually providing that incredible transportation services of critically important microbiota, which eventually are really important for our stomachs. And we know there's a really strong correlation with what we eat and the nutrients in it and the bugs in it and our microbiota in our stomachs, which then affects the rest of our body. Next slide. I've got to finish, I know. Some illustrations from the book. Next slide. Prey, harlequin ladybird with prey, vicious, amazing animals for pest control. Next slide. Next slide, sorry, I did cut some of these out. Beauty, carry on to the end if you get to the end. Yeah, so just to thank you for letting me speak very briefly about some of the things I've talked about. Rebugging the Planet is full of tips of how you can help provide an agroecological safe space for the bugs in your garden, in your green spaces. And one tiny thing I wanted to say, even if you've got no garden or allotment, you can be part of a green space revival in your parks, even in your green verges, even if you're not producing food on the old road verge or a little scrubby patch. You might not be producing food, but you'll be producing the critical refuge, food source and space for a bug, which will then go on to pollinate a food space. So all of it's about food and all of it's about nature and well-being. I'll leave it there. Sorry, I've gone on.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you for sharing those beautiful photos of such curious animals, and it's so easy to overlook the wealth of nature we have just on our doorsteps and under our noses. And I'm sure everyone will agree we would have loved to hear much more from you, but they can find out more in your book, as you said, Rebugging the Planet. Now, just before I introduce the next speaker, I'd like to remind everyone we're going to have a Q&A session immediately after Chiara speaks. So again, please drop any questions you have in the Q&A. Chiara Tornaghi is an urban community gardener with a passion for medicinal herbalism. She is an associate professor of urban food sovereignty at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at the Coventry University, and she's going to give us some insights of her research and activities now. So, Chiara, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I will share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So I was invited today to speak about agroecological principles in urban context. And I will also try, while I illustrate some of these, also to speak about why I think we need to move from urban agroecology to an agroecological urbanism. So essentially why we need different cities from the one we have today. Oops, there we go. Yeah, so I will begin with a couple of slides with some definitions about agroecology and what we talk about when we talk about urban context. Then I have a few slides showing agroecological principle in action, and then I will return to the issues of our agroecology, about what challenges agroecology faces to be more established in cities and urban context. And I will conclude with a couple of slides taken from the results of a research project I'm working at the moment on how to work towards the establishment of an agroecological urbanism. So what is agroecology? So as Vicki said, agroecology is a science, but it is also a social movement and a practice. And effectively, agroecology has been there for a long time. It is really rooted in peasant practices and is a value-based package of activities that center around multi-species solidarities, biodiversity, and environmental stewardship. And it includes social and ecological principles. In terms of ecological principle, we're talking about working with natural cycles, not using synthetic inputs, and practices that are resource conserving and non-extractive on the environment. But also includes social practices, so social and environmental justice, decent and fair livelihood for workers. It is culturally sensitive, so we mean that it's respecting and promoting cultural aspects of food. And it is built on history of feminist practice and land justice and their respective movements. And it's also rooted in non-hierarchical and inclusive pedagogical processes that contribute to regenerating agroecological knowledge across generations and across communities. So what are we talking about when we think about agroecology in urban context? So what is an urban context? So it is a densely populated space with a diversity of communities. And by diversity, we also mean cultural diversity, we mean migrants, we mean people with very different backgrounds and knowledges that come together. But it's what Amanda Huron called a place that is saturated with strangers. So those are not necessarily spaces that have a community that is cohesive, that they know each other and that they are still able to share. So this is one of the challenges of establishing a project in an urban context. There is high competition for land, gentrification and real estate speculation, expanding cementification, especially towards greenbelts in peri-urban lands. They used to be farmlands. So we are talking about spaces that look like the one in the picture. So this is a picture of Brussels, where we can see the dense center in the background, and then an expanding metropolis towards what used to be agricultural land. And this is progressively fragmenting what are agricultural lands, making very difficult for farmers to survive, very difficult to maintain the infrastructure, the roadworks, the irrigation channel, and those solidarities among farmers to be able to share manure, to share tools, etc. So it is progressively a space that is polluted, where soil, water, and air are polluted, where biodiversity is endangered, and where there is a progressive separation between consumers and producers. We have a progressive loss of food knowledge. So within this context, obviously we are not going to be too frozen by this picture. There is a lot that community groups and community gardens can do. So I will have a couple of slides around agroecological principle in urban context. So respect of local cultures and knowledge is a pillar, is probably one of the things that distinguish urban agriculture together with social justice from urban agroecology. So it's a place where we celebrate the diversity, where we celebrate the peasant knowledge and way of growing. So here in these slides, you can see pictures of what is called the Three Sisters, or the Milpa mexicana, which is a way of growing three types of plants together because they benefit each other. So we have pumpkins that are covering the soil, so preventing humidity from escaping or slowing down that process. We have corn that provides structure for beans to climb, and then we have beans that fix nitrogen into the soil. So the plants are grown together. They are known to grow better than if we were grown into monocultures. So a lot of these design principles and ecological principles exist in agroecology, and they are shared across communities. So communities that grow this were traditionally Central American people, but also communities elsewhere that are learning from that knowledge. So we have a variety of these practices and experiences that is worth exploring. But agroecology is not just about farming, it's also about celebrating what we call weeds, celebrating wild plants. And plants often choose where to grow, so they grow better in certain environments where they still experience all the challenges of the climate. And so research is showing that the more plants are growing in the wild, the more they carry nutritional and medicinal benefits. So this slide shows some of the practice I've been involved myself in sharing medicinal knowledge from the region in the north of Italy where I come from. Agroecology is also centered around the recycling of biomass and closing nutrient cycles and nutrient loops. So here we have two pictures, one from a community composting in Rotterdam, where a number of people living close to that park have been sharing knowledge with the community around on how to use that compost, how to bring their own garden waste or their own kitchen waste to share and create a compost that then can be used in the community garden surrounding this place. The picture on the right is a picture from Argentina, where the council has been involved in sharing and supporting the use of byproducts from a beer industry into municipal farms. So this is in a way easier because the organic waste is already of one type, so it doesn't need sorting at the source, but it requires some support in terms of policy and in terms of transport to make this available. This is a picture that shows another principle of agroecology, so soil care, by mulching, cover crops, and promoting an active soil biology. So obviously, many of you will know that clover helps fixing nitrogen in the soil. So when you grow it at the bottom of taller plants, it supports them in growing healthy. The picture below is from one of my current research projects. So we were in Argentina and again exploring how the municipality has been transporting their own trimmings from trees and leaves that come from public trees into the community gardens to provide organic matter. And these were broken down by adding cows' rumens from the slaughterhouse industry, because cows' stomachs essentially contain bacteria that they enable the cows to break down grass effectively. So they found that adding this to the compost enabled them to obtain a compost very, very quickly. And this is a last picture of the examples I want to show that is about biodiversity. So that biodiversity includes also cultural biodiversity. So we have people diversity and their wisdom, but we have a diversity in the soil, we have diversity in seeds, and this can be promoted a lot through education. So the pictures on the right I want to comment on is from one of our visits in London with Organic Lea, where we were observing how plants exchange nutrients, how they are able to access nutrients in the soil. And this is in synergy with mycorrhizal, so type of fungi.
Sorry, Chiara, that's 1 minute left.
Yes. So I'm coming to the challenges because obviously the practices I've shown are can easily be reproduced by community groups and practices, but there are also more structural problems, structural challenges for expanding and establishing agroecology in urban contexts. And some of these relate to the progressive loss of land due to expansion, progressive pollution, destruction of soil, progressive loss of farmers. So these require coordinated action, require politicizing these issues, require people coming together, pushing for change. And on the column of the left, on the left, I have some areas of policy that could address these issues. And this is a slide of 8 areas that emerge from one of my research projects, areas around which we could build an agroecological urbanism. So these are areas that need repoliticized, that need further conversations, that need policy and need community groups strongly engaged in them. In some cases, especially in London, we have observed them already. So community kitchens, for example, are places where you can have local food growing, local transforming, linked with farmers. So they are kind of mini labs for transforming the food system. Political pedagogies are already a way of learning and sharing knowledge, and they can be really incubators of making all those reconnections that are fundamental for changing essentially the way we urbanize, changing the way we live in urban context, changing our value system. And I'm mindful of time, so there is much more to say about this. But I have a couple of graphics. So for each of those 8 areas, we are developing through fieldwork, interviews, and dialogues with people on the ground, we are developing key messages. So this is an illustration that came out from this work around the political pedagogies towards an agroecological urbanism. So valuing care and solidarity, valuing the colonial anti-racist work, a multiplicity of learning approaches, and the importance of slowness for building territories, for building reconnections, and for resourcing care. And the final slide is around the community kitchens. And again, it looks at them as essentially places where we recognize the labor of social reproduction and environmental stewardship. And I will leave it here for now. Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant, Chiara. Thanks for situating us in the context of global challenges at the very local level, and giving a really comprehensive overview of agriculture impacting the urban environment. We've got time now for a few questions before we move on to the next round of speakers. So I've got some in the chat, some really great questions here. So Mark asks, he asked, has anyone tried to quantify and add up all of the health, sustainability and community benefits of growing in urban areas? If we were able to do this, it might unlock wider support and more funding for urban growing. So would anyone like to speak to this question of how we can economically quantify all of these benefits and make a stronger case to decision makers?
I'll go first. I don't have, off the top of my head, I don't have any studies, but there have been studies quantify different parts of the equation in terms of food growing in urban areas. And there was a recent study, I think Sheffield did, how much we could be growing in urban areas, which would complement the rural production, and actually could significantly increase our level of fruit and veg intake potentially, and near to markets where it's needed, fresh food to markets. So critically important, but all those natural capital outcomes as well could all be measured. I'm talking to somebody tomorrow about how we can measure, for instance, the waste recycling circular process by using waste from the urban environment, and flood alleviation, water retention. So there's lots of multiple ways we could be measuring it. And yeah, I absolutely agree. We need to be doing that in order to make the case for more.
Maybe I could also add the fact that normally we don't quantify the environmental externalities of the conventional food system. So we just don't include that they are destroying the environment, destroying soils, causing climate change. So I'm not in general in favor of quantifications, because I think that nature has a right to exist in itself. We don't need to justify in human terms, but if you have to do a calculation, then let's look into how much the mainstream system is causing externality, and what we can do in terms of also of human happiness and environmental health locally.
Yeah, that's something I didn't have time to kind of put in our talk, but yeah, there's definitely very controversial to kind of put economic value on the ecological services provided by pollinators, for example. We did it as a way of kind of making it very tangible to the growers that we were working with. So it was more of an illustration. But I have to say, we have had a lot of interest from kind of local councils and things on the back of our work where we have quantified the productivity, because I think, you know, it depends on who you're trying to engage. For some stakeholders, numbers and values and economic valuations is what speaks to them, or is, you know, what the data they need to convince the people who are above them, for example. So yeah, but I agree, I don't think nature should have to kind of justify its existence. There are some studies, there were quite a few studies done, not necessarily in the context of food production, but in the context of spending time in nature and the kind of health and well-being benefits of nature. And a few years ago, a big study about kind of the savings that could be made to the NHS, for example, through prescribing in nature. So the data is probably all out there in some formats, but I'm not aware of anyone who's kind of pulled that all together. But there's definitely some really great research groups looking at this on a much larger scale that we did, and considering many more of the costs and benefits, and kind of putting values to that.
Yeah, really complex question, and it's always a challenge when you're talking about emergent properties like a flourishing community. How do we quantify that? But yeah, great work to see elements being advocated for, and that having an impact on local policy. We've got two questions here from Julia and Jackie, both asking about what any practical tips to encourage insects in the garden, insects and invertebrates. Vicki, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, people ask, I've done a lot of talks around my book, and the first thing I say, be a bit messy, leave spaces for nature around the plots, obviously, and have as diverse plots as you can, because the more different flowering plants and other plants, the more likely it is you'll get more bugs and them interacting in ways which are useful. And having things like wood piles to provide space for a lot of for beetles and other insects to make nests can be really beneficial in terms of pest control as well, but also provide space for the bugs. So messiness, piles, and diversity, and obviously cutting out the chemicals, in sort of ensuring by having a more diverse plot as well, you've got less to lose to one particular disease or pest. And so having that diversity, but it also means that they don't take over. So you have you're unlikely to have a real sort of crash of your cropping pattern for the year if you've got more different types of produce. And the bugs will, you know, the pests, there won't be pests, they'll just be bugs, and they'll be doing what they do and helping you in most places.
Great. Sorry, Beth, would you like?
Oops, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I mean, Vicki covered most things there. I guess somebody mentioned companion planting in the questions, and so we also did a kind of citizen science experiment around that because some of our participants were noticing that they weren't actually seeing that many insects on their flowering crops, and a lot of flowering crops are not super attractive to insects. So things like tomatoes don't produce nectar, for example. But we demonstrated that if you do put lots of pollinator attractive plants like borage and other kind of nectar producing flowers in your plots, then you'll be attracting the insects in, you get better yields, but also there's plenty of food to kind of sustain those populations for when your crop has finished flowering. And that's another big problem with kind of conventional farming, things like oilseed rape. As soon as that bloom is over, there's just no food in that landscape for pollinators anymore. So their populations have built up, and then there's a big crash. So yeah, thinking about plants other than the crops that you want to eat is really good.
Super. I'm aware time is pressing on, but I would like to get to one question about the three sisters planting method, which Chiara, you mentioned in your talk. Practical question: do you have any advice on the order in which you plant those?
No, but it really depends on where you are and what's the climate in your particular context. So obviously pumpkins, they are more susceptible to frost than other plants. So, but just try and experiment. So the timing, I've already noticed that, you know, moving around and living in different places, that the timing of when you plant things, it really depends on where you are, because every single garden has its own microclimate. So it can change a lot from the books.
I found in my experience, it's really crucial to get the corn off quickly, because the squash and the peas are both so vigorous when they get going, they can easily swamp a tiny corn plant. So that would be my suggestion, get the corn out first. Mike, do you have an input, and then we'll have to move on?
Yeah, I was just about to say I've been trying to grow the Three Sisters for the last 5 years in Manchester, and still haven't figured it out quite for our climate. But I was going to say later cropping beans are always good to climb up the corn, and just try a few different layouts of it as well. There's loads of different varieties of layouts, but it massively depends on your climate and environment and the different types that you use.
Yeah, so there's so many fantastic questions, and I wish we could speak to them all, but time is pressing on. There is one question about finding community growing groups in your local area, and I would suggest everybody and anybody who's interested in finding local community groups have a look at the Good to Grow map on Sustain's website, because you can find loads of fantastic information there. In the next two speakers are going to give some reflections of their experience applying agroecological principles in practice in the urban environment. So we're going to start by hearing from Idman Abdurahaman, who is a member of is associated with Cordwainer's Grow and Bloom in East London. Idman is a gardener and community organizer based in Hackney. She will be sharing her work with Cordwainer's Grow, which focuses on building community through food growing and nature connection. So Idman, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just going to start off with sharing my screen. Can you see that all right?
Yep, we can see that.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to Capital Growth for inviting me to take part in this talk. And to Beth, Chiara, and Vicki, it's been really insightful hearing about your work. So yeah, my name is Idman Abdurahaman, and I was invited to share some examples of community gardening projects here in Hackney. Besides gardening, I also work on kind of food poverty and food justice projects in the borough. So it's really nice being a part of different aspects of the local food movement. To give a little background, Cordwainer's Grow is a Hackney-based community interest company, and we focus on connecting people with the natural world in creative and collaborative ways. We've been an active organization since 2010 and established a Cordwainer's community garden. After being there for about 9 years, we lost our green space in 2019 due to building developments, but that did not stop us. We have since continued our mission by developing mobile teaching and learning and sharing space for socially inclusive activities around art, heritage, horticulture, community, and public space development. The Union of Hackney Gardens was set up in 2019 by members of Cordwainer's Grow and has a membership of around 73 growing spaces in the borough. This is a member-led project that supports gardens and liaises directly with the Hackney Council around members' concerns, interests, and support. We offered monthly gatherings from September 2019 to March 2020 to support food growing and to help people bring more nature into their streets, balconies, and gardens. At the start of COVID, these were quickly switched to weekly online advice sessions and special activities focused on promoting organic and biodiverse practices. So yeah, during lockdown, we did start, one second, I'll just change this slide. During lockdown, we did start hosting more online activities for Cordwainers and for the Union. We also felt that a need to respond to the rise in social isolation and food insecurity in our local communities. So we ran a series of funded and unfunded projects For example, regularly delivering growing kits and garden maps to individuals and families that are at risk. The garden maps, I've included some pictures of some of the maps, came about in 2019. And at the start of the pandemic, we updated them. They're basically nature maps of different areas in the borough, highlighting some of the gardens that are part of the union, encouraging residents to engage with and support their local green spaces on their lockdown walks. Easy Grow Greens was another fun project we did in 2020, supported by the council. We spent some time setting up in different council estates, handing out seeds, doing kind of demonstrations and showing residents how to grow winter greens at home. The main aim of that project was to introduce residents to growing in a really accessible and easy way, with the end goal of helping them implement food growing beds in the gardens on the estates. So yeah, since the loss of our Cordwainer's community garden, we have been mainly operating from the Victoria Park outdoor classroom, where we host a range of kind of family nature activity and events, training sessions. We also have, I think for the past 2 summers, been growing fresh produce to donate to local migrant centers and food banks, and also inviting people from the migrant center to come and volunteer, kind of learn about where the food comes from. Another project that is ongoing at the moment is the St. Matthew's Community Garden that was set up in Clapton last year. So this garden is a partnership between Cordwainer Grove, St. Matthew's Church, and the Round Chapel Community Centre. The people at the church and locals were really eager to create a community resource at the heart of Clapton, bringing communities together. So the first group we engaged with was the families projects at the Round Chapel. And some of these families live in temporary accommodation and don't have much access to green space, or have never really had the opportunity or invitation to engage in gardening and learn about the natural environment. So these young families have really ended up being the ones really carrying the project forward, reviving that green space, focusing on the role nature access plays in improving physical and mental health. Our role was to essentially be there to facilitate them, taking ownership, creating a space, creating a sense of safety and belonging at that green space. And yeah, we hope to continue to develop this program if we get more resources, doing more intergenerational activities and looking into pathways to employment and training opportunities. The Bloom series started in 2020 in collaboration with Black Rose Bloom in response to the rise of Black Lives Matter movement and the lack of diversity and inclusion in gardens and green spaces. The essence of Bloom is to uplift and center the knowledge and practices of Black, female, and gender nonconforming nature practitioners. And this is particularly important because of how marginalized people have often been left out of the mainstream horticultural and nature narrative. So it started as an online series and people seem to really like it. So we managed to raise some funds to host in-person workshops and training sessions last summer across gardens and green spaces in Hackney with the help of the union. So we were at locations including Hackney Herbal Gardens, Hackney City Farm, Dawson Curve, making sure that each session was set in the appropriate environment and space. Another really important aspect of the series was to invite a mix of practitioners, from experienced growers and facilitators to elders and people who'd never held workshops before, some of which now have gone on to continue leading more sessions and developing their practices. One of the Bloom facilitators actually moved on from being a volunteer to becoming a trainer at the space where she held her first workshop. So it really shows the importance of empowering individuals to develop their skills and to not be afraid to lead and teach others and take up space. So rich community has been built from Bloom. Some pictures. A rich community has been built from Bloom, and we are now kind of working on the next phase of the project looking at how to do co-design or do something more collaborative with the community. And yeah, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I guess to quickly sum it up, it's easy to underestimate the power of a garden. And in projects like Bloom, I believe, have prompted people to rethink our connection or disconnection to land, to the food system, to cultural practices, to the health of our ecosystems. And as our urban environments become home to more and more people, community gardens will continue to be a powerful place-based tool for creating local connections and enacting positive social change. So yeah, that's all from me. I'll stop sharing.
That was wonderful. You okay?
Stop sharing for me. I can't, it's not really working.
If you, I think the green button at the bottom, it might be red for you.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you, Idman. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I'll answer any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have another Q&A round just after the next speaker. But thanks for that insight into how regenerative agricultural practices can be part of a really inspiring urban community development program. And I'd love to hear more. So the next speaker and our last speaker is Mike Hodson of MUD KIC, Community Interest Company. Mike has a background in community gardening, youth work and graphic design, and is a core member of the team at MUD CIC. The MUD CIC is a non-profit social enterprise who finds solutions to the problems in local food systems. They advocate for food sovereignty and provide educational services to grow fruit, vegetables and herbs for the local community. So without further ado, Mike, I'd love to hear more.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having us. It's been really interesting listening to everyone. I kind of feel like I'm coming from more of a boots on the ground sort of place. I'm literally sat in one of our gardens now. But everything that, it's been really nice listening to everything that everyone said from a kind of more research point of view, and kind of makes me feel like we're doing things right from a agroecological point of view. For a little bit of background about MUD, we were formed in 2019, basically as a response to demand from our local community. We set up our first growing project called Plattfields Market Garden about 6 years ago, and it was myself and two friends who are now the directors of MUD, and we were doing it voluntary on evenings and weekends, basically developing an old crown green bowling green on the site of a local park in Fallowfield in South Manchester. And the more people that saw us working on the bowling green, the more people that came in and wanted to get involved. And then people started asking us, could we come and help them set up projects in their local area? So we all sat down one day and decided to form MUD and try and basically replicate what we've done at Plattfields Market Garden elsewhere. So at the moment, we're managing and helping grow on 5 different sites across Manchester, Greater Manchester, including Salford and Stockport, and they're all run slightly differently and all have slightly different outcomes. But our main emphasis is to try and grow as much food as possible wherever we can. So, for example, our project in Stockport is on top of a multi-storey car park, so it's all container growing, and the food from there goes towards a local restaurant called Where the Light Gets In, who've recently been awarded one of the first green Michelin stars, which hopefully us helping grow food up there was partly to do with that. And then we have the community garden in Salford called Mona Street, that it is mainly for community groups to gather together and grow together. And then we have a garden called the Pankhurst Plot, which is on site in another public park in Chorlton. And the food from that goes directly to our partner on that project, which is called Emmeline's Pantry and is a local food bank. And then we are currently in the process of building a 1 acre community market garden on the site of a local academy called the East Manchester Academy. So they had spare land on the grounds of their school and saw what we were doing across the city and wanted us to come in and set one up. And the idea for that is that during school and term time, it's going to be used as a place to educate the school children about food growing and nutrition. And then evenings and weekends, it will be open to the local community as a resource for them as well. Kind of based on what we've done at Plattfields Market Garden. So I'll talk a bit more in detail about Plattfields Market Garden, as it's kind of our flagship and a basis for everything else that we do. It's about just over 1 acre, but we have it sort of divided in a couple of different ways. We are a member of the Community Supported Agriculture Network and have a CSA scheme. It's a bit different from a lot of other CSA schemes in the country, as we started to try and do a crop share model, but because of the sort of transient nature of people that volunteer with us and that come down to the garden, it wasn't really working. So we have a subscription veg box scheme that people can sign up to, and people that volunteer with us get discount on that. So about half of the garden is dedicated to that and is more of a sort of traditional kind of growing space with kind of long formatted beds. And we're currently, for this season, I think we've got about 180 different varieties of fruit and veg that we're growing. So it's quite diverse and quite intensive. And we use a lot of the sort of agroecological principles of using cover crops. We have low input. Originally, because the site was a bowling green, the soil wasn't great. It's about 6 inches of topsoil and then about 6 inches of sand and then something called clinker underneath that. So that sort of massively limited and decided what we were able to grow. So we don't grow a lot of kind of like deep rooting varieties of veg. We do a lot of salads, alliums, a lot of fruit. So the land that we have has sort of decided what we can and can't grow for us. We do a lot of companion planting, a lot of crop rotation. We use cover crops. We have a community compost scheme on site, which has been funded by the National Lottery and IKEA as part of the Places Called Home fund. So the idea of that is people in the local community can bring down their food waste, compost it on site, and then take free compost away with them to grow at home. We're also planning on putting a bokashi system in this year so that we can compost all of our food waste from our kitchen. So we have a kitchen on site that we've had signed off for preserving and making like jams and chutneys, stuff like that. And we've got 2 on-site chefs. So any gluts or waste food that we have from our markets on a weekend, that gets processed into food that we then sell on our cafe, which we have on site that's open at weekends as well. we're trying to move towards a zero waste model where none of our gluts or veg left over from the weekends goes to waste. It's all processed back into food and products that then raise funds for the garden. Part of the reason we're set up as a CSA and have a veg bot scheme is so that we can kind of try and predict how much income we're going to get from veg and then try and raise funds to support that in other areas. So as well as growing veg on the market garden side of the garden, the rest of it is dedicated to our community work. So we have an event space where we put events on for the community throughout the year. Like, for example, we have kids parties, we do an apple day every year, we do workshops. We're having a beer festival this year with a load of local breweries. We're having a Kurdish New Year party this weekend with the local Kurdish community.
Sorry, Mike, that's 1 minute left.
Right. We also have a lot of partnerships on site with other community organisations. So we work with an organisation called MyCo, who grow mushrooms, and we've had a shipping container installed on site to grow mushrooms in there with them. We work with another organisation called Gaskell Garden Project, who do community outreach to local refugees and asylum seekers, and they get given a space to grow on site. That also means that we try and grow a lot of culturally appropriate varieties of food, particularly with the local Kurdish community that have got a lot of farming knowledge but haven't got space to grow. So we have a project called Bahari Kurdi at the moment, which means Kurdish spring, and we're growing varieties of Kurdish spinach and celery that they can't find in shops local. We have a massive volunteering programme. We've currently got about 800 volunteers signed up with us across our projects, and we do training with them, workshops. We're taking them out to another partner garden that we work with out in Cheshire, so we're trying to link up growers that are out in the countryside with local urban gardens as well, and trying to get as many people out of the city into the countryside as we can, who wouldn't have that opportunity otherwise. You can find out more about everything we're doing on our website, which is wearemud.org. That's about it. I could go on for a lot longer.
Yes, and I'm sure we'd all like to hear more, and especially I think many of us would like to visit some of the sites that you've mentioned. They sound like wonderful integrated spaces for the community to act locally on global challenges, as we've heard throughout this wonderful webinar. So we've got a little more time for some questions. I'd like to start with this one from Jackie for Idman and Mike, which is really about sort of practical community gardening projects. She says the main restriction for creating more of them is funding for staff, capacity and materials. So does anyone recommend a business model for more financially sustainable community garden projects? How do you guys manage this challenge of funding the project?
So we've had a lot of trouble with funding, mainly due to kind of rights to land. So because we grow on a lot of public land, we've not been able to get leases, and if you can't get leases, you can't get long-term funding for projects from a lot of funders. We're currently running at about 50% grant funded, and then 50% is commercial income that we make from our events, from selling produce, from our VegBot scheme. We also do contract work for private companies where we go out and set up growing spaces for them. Like a few examples is we've set up like raised beds for restaurants in the city centre, stuff like that. Selling workshops and skill-based educational courses is another income stream for us. I think the problem with grant funding is you a lot of the time you have to target a certain kind of demographic in order to run them, whereas a lot of stuff that we do is open to everyone in the community because everybody's got food in common. And we've got very mixed demographics of people that live local to the garden, so it's a really difficult one. We've had to diversify our income streams massively to be able to make it sustainable. And something that we figured out right from the get-go was that you can't financially sustainably grow veg exclusively on half an acre of land in a city centre. So yeah, doing as many different things as you can in order to be resilient. Like when COVID hit, a lot of our income was coming from the NHS for wellbeing services, and all that got cut overnight because all the funding was being put into COVID response. So we dealt with that by doing more social events. So yeah, you just got to be really flexible.
Thanks for that. Idman, there's a question for you. Ruth mentions that your work with Bloom has attempted to engage communities who are usually excluded from mainstream nature narratives. She wonders what kind of measures have you put in place to make these spaces more welcoming for these communities? How do you manage that question of inclusivity?
Well, I guess for me, I don't think it's that difficult because that is a focus in a lot of the community work that I do. I think it's really important to meet people where they are and really listen to what people's needs are. And I guess it's really important as well, I think, to bring in like when holding, like with Bloom, we brought in a variety of different facilitators with different backgrounds that were all kind of Black women. And I think it's really important as well to create those spaces, is to bring in trainers and give kind of paid opportunities to people. And I think that will attract kind of communities. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think just we have so much to do in gardens and green spaces. And yeah, we need to start giving more opportunities to paid opportunities to people to come and share their knowledge. So yeah, I think that's that's kind of an important aspect. And also looking at kind of interrogating what intention you have as well with the projects, like where are you coming from? Can people, especially if you're working, let's say with a group of like vulnerable people or people that experience a lot of trauma, they can easily sense if you don't have the right intention. So it's all about, how like meeting people where they are basically. And yeah, I guess too, also that last question with funding, I wish I had a good answer. We struggle with funding so much, and core costs is definitely not something that's included into funding. So we're definitely looking into different ways to kind of diversifying kind of money. But yeah, I mean, that is, I think, a battle for a lot of community gardens, looking at ways to kind of sustain their work.
Very true. And yeah, thanks for those reflections. Unfortunately, we are almost at the end, and I'm just going to close with some comments. In the meantime, I believe we're going to share another Mentimeter just to re-engage with those initial questions about what agroecology means. So Bella, would you like to share that with us? Super. So whilst those responses come in, I found this a really wonderful invocation of the power of agroecology to address all of the major crises we face as a species. And I think one of the real things that has come out of this webinar is the importance of reciprocity and connection and engagement through shared values and mutual benefit. We saw that with the first two speakers, Beth commenting on how much we gain from urban insects and their valuable contribution to pollination, but equally how much we can contribute. As Vicki said, we can play a role in promoting migration across fragmented landscapes and really ensure that the biodiversity with which we share the planet continues to have a space and flourish alongside us. Equally, I think there's what we've heard is some really great connections between theoretical academic work and really locally grounded practices and projects, which really goes to show that agroecology is a working discipline. It's not abstract. It's necessarily grassroots, and I think all of our speakers have really effectively grounded this notion of agroecology in local environments. So I'm really grateful for that. Just before we close, I have a few suggestions and calls to action. My colleagues at Sustain would like to suggest that everybody take the chance to engage in the government's peat consultation, which is ongoing, asking when and how we should go about phasing out peat from commercial and private horticulture. Unsustainable use of peat is devastating bog habitats in the UK currently, and it would be great if you could share your opposition to that. I believe that consultation is due to finish on Friday, so get in quick whilst you still can. Another reminder to have a look at Sustain's wonderful Good to Grow Day, which will be at the end of April. For those project leaders among us, please register. There's some fantastic resources that will give you some insight into how you can take part and promote your work as part of this campaign. And to those of you who aren't yet associated with the project, have a look at the map. There's loads of really inspiring projects all over the country, so really worth a look there. Just to say, I'm representing Social Farms and Gardens today. Myself and my colleague Amber, we deliver organisational capacity building training across London, which emphasises things like volunteer management, funding applications, managing your finances, all of the infrastructural things that happen around the community gardening and the kind of things we heard Mike discussing earlier, that make it that reduce the burden on the organisation and allow community groups to do more of this fantastic work. So please have a look at our website. We are offering a year-long training throughout the summer, so sign up to our newsletter and you'll find out more about that. And yeah, just finally, I thank you so much to all of the speakers, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope everyone can take advantage of the beautiful weather in this wonderful part of the year. As Mike said, it's New Year for many of the world's population. So Nowruz Mubarak for those of Central Asian inclination, and to everybody, I wish everyone luck in the new growing season, and I'm looking forward to seeing seeds sprouting and ideas ricocheting as a result of this fantastic webinar. So yeah, thanks again and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
What a lovely close, Richard. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant, beautiful, lovely. I have shared a link with you all for a Zoom room so we can go hop off for a debrief if that's all right. I'm just going to download the chat real quick, just in case. And